On the morning of October 14, 1957, 10-year-old Timothy Carter walked into Franklin Elementary School in suburban Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, carrying a hollowed-out nickel he had found on the sidewalk outside his home. The small coin, glinting innocuously in the autumn sunlight, felt oddly light in his palm. Timothy had no idea that this curious object would unravel one of the most carefully constructed Soviet spy operations in American history. His fifth-grade teacher, the well-respected and seemingly unremarkable Mr. Victor Anderson, believed he had built an impenetrable cover over 7 years of patient work. By the end of that school year, everything Mr. Anderson had constructed would collapse, and the boy who admired him most would become the unlikely instrument of his exposure. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. The Franklin Elementary School stood as a testament to post-war American optimism, a 2-story brick building surrounded by maple trees that turned brilliant shades of red and gold each fall. The neighborhood of Oakmont, where the school was located, represented everything Americans in the 1950s believed they were defending against communist infiltration. White picket fences lined the streets. Fathers drove to work in gleaming Chevrolets and Fords. Mothers wore pearl necklaces while grocery shopping. Children rode bicycles without fear, and every home displayed an American flag on patriotic holidays. Into this picture of suburban tranquility, Soviet intelligence had carefully inserted one of their most valuable assets, a man the neighborhood knew as Victor Anderson. Victor Anderson had arrived in Philadelphia in 1950, carrying forged documents that identified him as a Norwegian immigrant who had fled Europe after World War II. His real name was Viktor Andreev, and he was a highly trained KGB operative who had spent 3 years in Moscow learning to become invisible in American society. The KGB understood that the United States, with its open society and tradition of welcoming immigrants, presented unique opportunities for espionage that the closed Soviet system could never offer their adversaries. While the CIA struggled to place agents in Moscow, Soviet intelligence successfully embedded hundreds of operatives throughout America, from defense contractors to government agencies to, in rare cases, schools. The decision to place Viktor Andreev in a teaching position was unusual but strategic. Most Soviet spies in America during this period focused on industrial and military espionage, seeking information about nuclear weapons, radar technology, and aircraft design. The atomic spies of the 1940s, including Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, had demonstrated how devastating such intelligence breaches could be. By the time Victor arrived in America, however, Soviet priorities had expanded. Moscow wanted long-term assets who could provide political intelligence, identify potential recruits, and maintain cover so deep that even intense FBI scrutiny would reveal nothing suspicious. A schoolteacher, the KGB reasoned, was perfectly positioned to observe American society while arousing zero suspicion. Victor had prepared meticulously for his role. He studied American teaching methods, memorized details of Norwegian geography and culture, and practiced his accent until even native Norwegian speakers found nothing amiss in his speech. His legend, the spy term for a false biography, was remarkably detailed. He claimed to have attended the University of Oslo before the war, taught briefly in a small village near Bergen, and lost contact with his family during the Nazi occupation. These details were chosen carefully because they were difficult to verify. The university records had been damaged during the war. The small village had few records. His supposed family members were all conveniently dead or untraceable. When Victor applied for his teaching position at Franklin Elementary in the spring of 1950, the school board saw exactly what they expected to see: a cultured European intellectual, grateful for the opportunity to start fresh in America. For 7 years, Viktor Andreev lived as Victor Anderson with painstaking discipline. He taught 5th grade with genuine enthusiasm, graded papers conscientiously, and attended parent-teacher conferences with appropriate concern for his students' progress. He joined the local Lutheran church, though this required him to suppress years of atheistic indoctrination. He volunteered to coach the school's chess club, which provided a perfect explanation for his analytical mind and European background. He dated occasionally but never seriously, explaining to curious neighbors that he was still searching for the right person after losing so much in the war. Every detail of his life was calculated to create an image of normalcy. But beneath this carefully constructed facade, Victor was fulfilling his true mission. His primary role was to serve as a courier for other Soviet agents operating in the Philadelphia area. The region was home to several defense contractors, including companies working on advanced radar systems and jet propulsion technology. Soviet intelligence had successfully recruited a handful of engineers and technicians who had access to classified information, but getting that information safely to Moscow required careful handling. Victor's teaching position provided perfect cover for his courier activities. His summer vacations allowed for extended trips, supposedly to visit Norwegian communities in the Midwest, but actually to meet with KGB handlers. His habit of attending educational conferences gave him reasons to travel to New York, Washington, and other cities where dead drops could be serviced. The dead drop system was a cornerstone of Soviet espionage tradecraft. Rather than meeting face-to-face, which risked both parties if either was under surveillance, agents would leave materials in pre-arranged hiding spots. A Soviet spy might tuck microfilm behind a loose brick in a bridge abutment, place a hollowed-out battery in a park trash can, or hide documents inside a tree hollow. The courier would retrieve the material later, never making direct contact with the source. This system had one critical vulnerability. The dead drop containers themselves had to be innocuous objects that wouldn't attract attention if accidentally discovered. Soviet intelligence became remarkably creative, hollowing out coins, batteries, bolts, pencils, and other everyday items to conceal microfilm. The hollowed-out nickel that Timothy Carter found on the sidewalk outside his home on that October morning in 1957 was one such container. Victor had received it 3 days earlier from a KGB officer operating under diplomatic cover at the Soviet consulate in New York. The nickel contained microfilm with instructions for servicing several dead drops in the Philadelphia area, along with questions Moscow wanted answered by Victor's sources. The ingenious coin had been split along its edge, creating two thin halves held together by a tiny magnet. To the casual observer, it appeared completely normal. Only someone who knew the trick of applying pressure at precisely the right point could open it. Victor had carried the nickel in his pocket for 2 days, waiting for the right moment to open it and photograph the contents with his concealed Minox camera. On the morning of October 12th, he had walked to a park 3 blocks from his apartment to service the dead drop. Somewhere during that walk, the nickel had slipped from his pocket, perhaps when he pulled out his handkerchief, perhaps when he reached for his keys. He didn't notice the loss until that evening. The realization struck him like a physical blow. 7 years of perfect tradecraft, compromised by a moment of carelessness. Victor spent the next day retracing his route, searching desperately for the distinctive coin. He examined every inch of sidewalk, scoured the park, and even returned after dark with a flashlight. Nothing. The nickel could have fallen into a storm drain. A passing stranger could have picked it up. It might be lying in grass somewhere, overlooked. Each possibility tormented him. If the coin fell into the wrong hands, if someone managed to open it, if the microfilm was discovered, the entire network could be compromised. But Victor was a professional. He had been trained for scenarios like this. He filed a careful report with his handler, continued his normal routine, and watched vigilantly for any sign that his cover had been blown. Timothy Carter found the nickel 2 days later, lying on the sidewalk near his house. He was 10 years old, skinny, with dark hair that fell perpetually across his forehead, and a curiosity about how things worked that drove his mother to distraction. His room was filled with disassembled radios, motors from broken toys, and jars containing insects he was studying. When he picked up the nickel and felt its strange lightness, his first thought wasn't about its value, but about why it felt wrong. A nickel should have a certain heft. This one felt hollow. That evening, Timothy sat at his desk with a magnifying glass, examining the coin carefully. He noticed a tiny seam around the edge, so fine that it was almost invisible. He pressed experimentally at different points, and suddenly the coin popped open in his hands, split into 2 perfect halves. Inside, wedged into the hollow space, was a tiny piece of film, so small he could barely see the images on it without his magnifying glass. Timothy didn't know what he was looking at, but he knew it was unusual. He carried the coin to school the next morning, planning to show it to Mr. Anderson, his favorite teacher, the one person who always had time to explain interesting things. Victor Anderson was writing math problems on the blackboard when Timothy arrived early that morning. The classroom smelled of chalk dust and the distinctive scent of mimeograph fluid from freshly copied worksheets. October sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. Timothy approached the desk eagerly, the split nickel held carefully in his palm. He said he found something strange and wanted to know what it was. Victor turned from the blackboard and looked down at the boy's outstretched hand. For a fraction of a second, less time than a heartbeat, his carefully controlled expression cracked. Timothy, young as he was, saw something cross his teacher's face, something that looked like fear. Victor recovered instantly, his training reasserting control. He said the coin looked interesting and asked where Timothy had found it. The boy explained about the sidewalk near his house, about how the coin felt too light, about discovering the seam and the strange film inside. Victor felt his pulse pounding in his ears, but his voice remained calm and curious. He suggested Timothy show the coin to the school principal, Mr. Harold Brennan, who collected unusual coins and might know more about it. This decision, made in a split second, reflected Victor's training. Drawing attention to the discovery himself would be suspicious. Directing the boy to someone else while appearing helpful seemed natural. But Timothy noticed something. Mr. Anderson's hand, when he reached out to examine the coin more closely, was shaking slightly. The boy had never seen his teacher's hands shake before. Mr. Anderson always had steady hands, whether writing on the blackboard or demonstrating how to properly hold a microscope. The tiny tremor registered in Timothy's mind as wrong, though he couldn't articulate why. Principal Harold Brennan was a former Navy officer who had served in the Pacific during World War II. He was a large man with a stern demeanor that concealed a genuine affection for children. When Timothy appeared in his office with the split nickel, Brennan examined it with immediate interest. Unlike Timothy, Brennan had seen classified materials during his military service. He recognized microfilm when he saw it, even if he couldn't read what was on it. His wartime experience had included briefings about espionage, and he knew that hollowed-out coins were mentioned in those briefings as Soviet espionage tools. Brennan asked Timothy several careful questions. Where exactly had he found the coin? Had he shown it to anyone else? The boy explained about finding it on the sidewalk and showing it to Mr. Anderson. Brennan felt his stomach tighten. He told Timothy this was very interesting indeed, and that he needed to keep the coin for a while to research it properly. He suggested Timothy not mention it to other students just yet, framing it as wanting to surprise everyone with a full explanation later. The boy agreed readily, thrilled to be part of what felt like a mystery. After Timothy left, Brennan sat at his desk, holding the split nickel and contemplating what to do. It was 1957, the height of Cold War paranoia in America. Senator Joseph McCarthy's communist witch hunts had dominated headlines for years. The Rosenbergs had been executed just 4 years earlier. Every American had been told to watch for signs of communist infiltration. Brennan knew he should contact the FBI, but he hesitated. What if this was nothing? What if the coin was simply an unusual novelty item, and he triggered an investigation that disrupted the school over nothing? The deciding factor was Timothy's mention of showing the coin to Mr. Anderson. Brennan respected Victor as a teacher, but he also knew very little about the man's background before he arrived at Franklin Elementary. The war in Europe had created millions of displaced persons. Documentation was often missing or forged. Someone with malicious intent could easily hide among the genuine refugees. If there was even the smallest possibility that one of his teachers was involved in espionage, Brennan had a responsibility to investigate. That afternoon, Brennan telephoned the local FBI field office. The agent who took his call listened with growing interest and asked him not to discuss the matter with anyone, especially not Mr. Anderson, until agents could examine the coin. 2 FBI agents arrived at the school within hours, dressed in the dark suits and fedoras that had become their unofficial uniform. They examined the nickel in Brennan's office, photographed it extensively, and carefully removed the microfilm. One agent had a small portable viewer, and when he examined the film, his expression hardened. He told Brennan this was definitely a matter of national security and that the investigation would expand immediately. The FBI had been hunting Soviet spies in America since the early 1940s. By 1957, the Bureau had refined its counterintelligence techniques considerably. The Venona project, though still highly classified, had given investigators crucial insights into how Soviet spy networks operated. The FBI knew about dead drops, hollowed-out coins, and the use of microfilm. What they didn't know was the identity of many spies who were still operating. Every piece of physical evidence was precious, a potential thread that could unravel an entire network. The microfilm from Timothy's nickel contained exactly the kind of intelligence the FBI sought. The coded instructions referenced specific locations in Philadelphia, dates for servicing dead drops, and code names for several operatives. While the FBI couldn't immediately decrypt all the information, the coded structure itself confirmed this was authentic Soviet intelligence material. Equally important was establishing a chain of custody. Timothy had found the coin near his home. Mr. Anderson had been the first adult to see it. The FBI needed to determine whether Anderson's involvement was coincidental or incriminating. The investigation proceeded with careful precision. FBI agents began conducting discreet surveillance on Victor Anderson, watching his movements, photographing everyone he met, and documenting his routine. They discovered he made regular trips to New York, supposedly to visit Norwegian cultural organizations. They noted he frequently walked in parks alone, behavior that could be innocent or could indicate he was servicing dead drops. They researched his background story and found the expected gaps in documentation, not uncommon for war refugees, but also not proof of innocence. Meanwhile, Victor was living through a nightmare. He knew the dropped nickel could expose him, but he didn't know whether anyone had found it or what they might have done with it. The fact that Timothy had brought it to school initially seemed like a disaster, but Timothy's innocent transparency might actually have protected Victor's cover. If the boy had shown the coin to his parents, if they had contacted authorities directly, suspicion might not have fallen on Victor at all. By directing Timothy to the principal, Victor had inadvertently placed himself at the center of any subsequent investigation. For 3 weeks, Victor maintained his normal routine while watching for surveillance. The FBI agents were skilled, but Victor had been trained to detect surveillance by the best counterintelligence officers in Moscow. He noticed the same car parked on different streets near his apartment. He observed a man reading a newspaper in a park who seemed more interested in Victor than in the newspaper. These signs could mean he was under investigation, or they could be paranoia. Without confirmation, he couldn't risk fleeing, which would immediately prove his guilt. In November, the FBI made their decision. Rather than arrest Victor immediately, they chose to watch him and see if he led them to other operatives. This decision reflected a broader shift in FBI counterintelligence strategy. Catching one spy was useful, but dismantling an entire network was far more valuable. Victor, if he was indeed a Soviet operative, might panic and attempt to warn his contacts. Those warnings could expose the entire Philadelphia network. The FBI was right. In late November, Victor received a message through a dead drop he had maintained for years, a hollow behind a loose brick in a wall near the Philadelphia Museum of Art. The message, encrypted and written on rice paper, thin enough to be quickly swallowed if necessary, informed him that Moscow was aware of potential compromise and wanted him to identify whether any of his contacts were under surveillance. This message was exactly what Victor had feared. It meant Moscow suspected a security breach, and Victor was ordered to risk exposure to determine its extent. Victor spent 2 agonizing days considering his options. He could attempt to flee the country, but getting to the Soviet Union from Philadelphia would require help from his network, and contact with that network might expose everyone. He could stay and maintain his cover, hoping the dropped nickel had never been found or had been dismissed as a novelty. Or he could actively investigate whether he was under surveillance, a dangerous choice that could confirm any suspicions against him. Timothy Carter, meanwhile, had largely forgotten about the unusual nickel. Mr. Brennan had explained that it was indeed an unusual coin, possibly a novelty item from Europe. and that he was researching its origin. Timothy, satisfied with this explanation, had moved on to other interests. He was currently building a crystal radio set, attempting to receive broadcasts from as far away as possible. His bedroom had become a tangle of wires, his parents both exasperated and proud of his intellectual curiosity. In early December, Victor made his move. Following Moscow's instructions, he arranged to meet one of his most valuable sources, a radar engineer at a defense contractor who had been providing technical documents for over a year. The meeting was risky but necessary. Victor needed to determine whether his network was compromised, and direct contact with a source would either confirm security or expose the breach. The FBI surveillance team, watching Victor's every move, saw him deviate from his normal routine and followed. The meeting took place in a downtown Philadelphia cafeteria, crowded and anonymous. Victor sat at a table near the back, drinking coffee and reading a newspaper. The radar engineer, a man named Robert Hayes, who believed he was helping the Soviet Union achieve strategic parity and prevent nuclear war, sat down across from him. Their conversation appeared casual, two acquaintances catching up. But Victor was carefully checking for any sign that Hayes was under surveillance or cooperating with authorities. He saw nothing suspicious in Hayes's demeanor, which should have been reassuring but instead felt wrong. If the FBI had found the nickel, if they had connected it to Victor, they would be watching this meeting. FBI agents photographed the encounter from multiple angles. They identified Robert Hayes within hours, tracing him to his employment at the defense contractor and confirming he had access to classified information. This was the breakthrough they needed. The investigation expanded rapidly, with additional agents assigned to surveilling Hayes and tracing his contacts. Within 2 weeks, the FBI had identified 3 more engineers who were passing information to Soviet intelligence, all part of the network Victor had been servicing. On December 19, 1957, FBI agents arrested Victor Anderson at his apartment at 6 in the morning. He was drinking coffee, dressed in slacks and a cardigan, preparing to grade papers before school started. When he opened the door and saw the federal badges, he knew his career as a Soviet spy had ended. The agents found his Minax camera hidden in a hollowed-out book, several one-time code pads disguised as ordinary notepads, and instructions for dead drops written in invisible ink that could only be seen under ultraviolet light. Victor, knowing the evidence was overwhelming, said nothing. He had been trained for this scenario. He would provide no information, admit no guilt, and wait for whatever Moscow could arrange. The arrest of Victor Anderson sent shockwaves through Franklin Elementary School and the Oakmont neighborhood. Parents who had trusted this man with their children learned he was a Soviet spy. Teachers who had worked alongside him for years discovered they had never really known him at all. The school board called an emergency meeting. Principal Brennan briefed the staff, carefully explaining what had happened while trying to minimize panic. The word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, carried by telephone calls and conversations over backyard fences. Timothy Carter learned about his teacher's arrest when FBI agents came to interview him. 2 agents, trying to be as gentle as possible with a 10-year-old boy, asked him detailed questions about finding the nickel and showing it to Mr. Anderson. They wanted to know exactly what his teacher had said, how he had reacted, whether he had seemed nervous. Timothy remembered the shaking hand, the flash of fear he had seen cross Mr. Anderson's face. He told the agents about these observations, not fully understanding their significance. The psychological impact on Timothy was profound. He had admired Mr. Anderson, trusted him, and enjoyed their conversations about science and mathematics. Learning that his teacher was a spy who had lied about everything, who had used his position to betray the country, shattered something in Timothy's understanding of the world. His parents tried to reassure him that he had done nothing wrong, that finding the coin was simply bad luck for Mr. Anderson and good luck for the country. But Timothy felt responsible, as if his curiosity had ruined his teacher's life. He would spend years working through these complicated feelings. The FBI interrogation of Viktor Andreev, conducted in a secure facility outside Philadelphia, followed protocols developed through years of counterintelligence work. Victor provided only his name, rank in the KGB, and a statement that he wished to be repatriated to the Soviet Union. He refused to answer any questions about his network, his sources, or his activities. This was exactly what his training demanded. Soviet intelligence doctrine emphasized that captured agents should provide nothing that could compromise others, even under intense pressure. The FBI didn't need Viktor's cooperation. The evidence from his apartment, combined with surveillance photographs and the microfilm from Timothy's nickel, gave investigators everything they needed to dismantle the network. Robert Hayes and 3 other engineers were arrested in coordinated raids. 2 other individuals, including a secretary at a defense contractor who had been providing employment records, were taken into custody. The FBI recovered hundreds of documents that had been photographed and prepared for transmission to Moscow. The intelligence loss to Soviet operations in the Philadelphia area was devastating. Viktor's trial began in March 1958 and lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of espionage, including the contents of the microfilm, testimony from FBI agents, and physical evidence from Viktor's apartment. The defense attorney, appointed by the court after Viktor refused to secure his own representation, argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that Viktor was being persecuted for his political beliefs. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. The sentencing hearing provided the only moment when Viktor broke his silence. The judge, a stern man who had served as a prosecutor during the espionage trials of the 1940s, asked if Viktor had anything to say before sentence was pronounced. Viktor stood and delivered a brief statement in which he declared that he had acted according to his conscience, that he believed in the Soviet cause, and that he regretted nothing. The judge sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison, a relatively lenient sentence compared to the Rosenberg's execution, reflecting the fact that Viktor's espionage had focused on industrial rather than atomic secrets. The network's dismantling revealed the sophisticated nature of Soviet espionage in America during the 1950s. The KGB had successfully recruited Americans who genuinely believed they were helping to prevent war by providing the Soviet Union with information that would create strategic balance. Robert Hayes, the radar engineer, testified that he had been approached by someone who appealed to his fear of nuclear war, arguing that Soviet weakness made war more likely and that sharing certain technical information would create a deterrent. Hayes was sentenced to 15 years. The other engineers received similar sentences. Their betrayal was motivated not by money, but by ideology, making them more dangerous in some ways than mercenary spies. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of America's open society to espionage. Viktor had built his cover over 7 years, integrating himself into a community and gaining trust through consistent behavior. The only reason he was caught was a moment of carelessness, dropping a hollowed-out nickel that happened to be found by a curious child who happened to notice it felt wrong. Without that coincidence, Viktor might have continued operating indefinitely. This realization troubled FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who ordered a comprehensive review of vetting procedures for immigrants and expanded surveillance of individuals in sensitive positions. The story of how a 10-year-old's curiosity exposed a Soviet spy network became national news. Timothy Carter's photograph appeared in newspapers across the country, usually alongside images of the split nickel. The FBI praised his observant nature and civic responsibility. The school held an assembly where Timothy was commended for his role in protecting national security. President Eisenhower sent a letter thanking him for his service to the country, but Timothy himself felt deeply ambivalent about the recognition. He had admired Mr. Anderson, and part of him still couldn't reconcile the kind teacher with the Soviet spy. Franklin Elementary School struggled to move forward. Parents demanded reassurances that other staff members had been properly vetted. Teachers felt betrayed by Viktor's deception and defensive about their own innocence. The school board instituted new background check procedures, though these were hampered by the limited information systems available in the 1950s. Principal Brennan wrestled with his own feelings of responsibility. He had hired Viktor Anderson after a perfunctory review of his credentials. Should he have been more suspicious? Could he have prevented 7 years of espionage? These questions haunted him. The broader implications of the case resonated throughout the intelligence community. The CIA began studying the KGB's use of long-term deep cover agents, recognizing that Soviet intelligence was playing a decades-long game rather than seeking quick intelligence coups. The State Department tightened vetting procedures for refugees and immigrants, implementing more rigorous background checks, despite criticism that such measures betrayed America's identity as a welcoming nation. The Defense Department reviewed security procedures at contractors, implementing compartmentalization that made it harder for any single individual to access comprehensive information. Viktor Andreev served 12 years of his sentence before being exchanged in 1970 for 2 American intelligence officers captured in East Germany. The prisoner exchange took place on the Glienicke Bridge, connecting West Berlin to Potsdam, the same location where other famous spy swaps occurred during the Cold War. Viktor walked across the bridge into East Germany, where KGB officers waited to debrief him and assess whether he could continue serving Soviet intelligence in some capacity. He was 52 years old, his health damaged by years of imprisonment. His career as a field operative permanently ended. Timothy Carter grew up to become an engineer, specializing in communications technology. He rarely spoke about his role in exposing Viktor Andreev, finding the attention uncomfortable and the memories painful. In interviews conducted decades later, Timothy reflected on the complexity of his childhood experience. He said he understood intellectually that Viktor had been a spy who betrayed important information, but he also remembered a teacher who had been kind to children, who had encouraged his curiosity, who had made learning exciting. The two images never fully reconciled in Timothy's mind. The hollowed-out nickel became a permanent exhibit at the FBI headquarters in Washington, displayed alongside other espionage artifacts from the Cold War. Visitors who examine it are always struck by how ordinary it appears. Only when split open does it reveal its sinister purpose. The coin serves as a reminder that espionage often depends not on dramatic confrontations, but on small, easily overlooked details. A coin that feels too light, a hand that shakes when it shouldn't, a curious child who notices when something doesn't seem right. The Philadelphia spy network's exposure contributed to a broader understanding of Soviet espionage methods during the Cold War. Historians would later recognize that Soviet intelligence achieved remarkable success in penetrating American institutions during the 1940s and 50s. The KGB understood that recruiting Americans who believed in the communist cause created more reliable agents than mercenaries motivated by money. They also recognized that deep cover agents, with carefully constructed legends, could operate for years without detection, providing a steady stream of intelligence that accumulated into a comprehensive picture of American capabilities and intentions. The case also illustrated the role of chance in counterintelligence work. Despite extensive FBI surveillance and investigation, many Soviet spies were caught not through brilliant detective work, but through defections, careless mistakes, or sheer coincidence. The Venona project, which decrypted Soviet intelligence cables from the 1940s, wasn't revealed to the public until 1995, but it confirmed that Soviet spy networks in America were far more extensive than even the FBI suspected during the Cold War itself. Viktor Andreev's network was one of dozens operating across the United States during the 1950s. For the Oakmont neighborhood, the revelation that a Soviet spy had lived among them for 7 years prompted a period of introspection and paranoia. Neighbors who had welcomed Victor Anderson to backyard barbecues wondered what else they had missed. The casual assumption that everyone in a middle-class American suburb shared the same values and loyalties was shattered. This experience was replicated in communities across America during the Cold War, as espionage cases revealed that the enemy could be anywhere, even teaching children in an elementary school. The psychological warfare aspect of Soviet espionage cannot be underestimated. Beyond the actual intelligence gathered, the mere existence of spy networks created an atmosphere of suspicion and distrust that corroded social bonds. Senator McCarthy's communist hunts, though often excessive and destructive, were rooted in the real existence of Soviet espionage. The challenge for American society was maintaining security while preserving the openness and freedom that defined the nation's identity. This tension played out in countless ways, from workplace loyalty oaths to FBI surveillance of political activists to immigration restrictions. Viktor Andreev's story, after his return to the Soviet Union, followed a path common to many exchange spies. The KGB honored him as a hero who had maintained discipline under pressure, never betraying his comrades even when confronted with overwhelming evidence. He was given a comfortable apartment in Moscow, a modest pension, and opportunities to lecture at intelligence training schools about tradecraft and the American target. But Viktor struggled with his new life. After 12 years in an American prison, he found the Soviet Union, the country he had served with such dedication, to be oppressive and grey. He had spent 7 years living as an American, and despite his ideological commitment to communism, he had absorbed some of the values and habits of the culture he had infiltrated. Viktor died in Moscow in 1983, just 8 years before the Soviet Union's collapse. He never knew that the system he had served would crumble so completely. In his final years, he occasionally spoke with trusted colleagues about his time in America. He expressed respect for the FBI agents who had investigated him, admiration for the quality of American engineering that his network had targeted, and surprising fondness for some of his memories of teaching. He mentioned Timothy Carter once, telling an interviewer that the boy had possessed exactly the kind of curious, analytical mind that should be encouraged in education. Viktor apparently never learned that Timothy grew up to become the kind of engineer whose work would have been a prime target for Soviet intelligence. The FBI agents who worked the Andreev case went on to distinguished careers in counterintelligence. Several wrote memoirs that discussed the investigation, always emphasizing the role of Timothy's observation in breaking the case. They described the hollowed-out nickel as one of the most valuable pieces of evidence they had ever encountered, not because of what was on the microfilm, though that was important, but because it provided physical proof that Soviet espionage operations were active and sophisticated. The case became a training example for new FBI agents, illustrating both the patience required for counterintelligence work and the unpredictable factors that can determine success or failure. Principal Harold Brennan retired from Franklin Elementary in 1965, having served the school for 23 years. In his retirement speech, he reflected on the Andreev case, noting that it had taught him the importance of vigilance without paranoia. He said that schools had a responsibility to protect children, but that protection couldn't come at the cost of creating an atmosphere of fear and suspicion. Brennan expressed pride that Franklin Elementary had recovered from the scandal and continued to provide excellent education. He also expressed hope that Timothy Carter's role in the case would be remembered not as a child who destroyed his teacher, but as a young person whose curiosity and honesty served his country. The Cold War context in which these events occurred was defined by nuclear anxiety and ideological competition. By 1957, both the United States and Soviet Union possessed thermonuclear weapons capable of destroying civilization. Both nations were engaged in a technological race that encompassed rockets, computers, and military systems. Both were convinced that the other represented an existential threat. In this environment, espionage became a crucial tool for maintaining strategic balance and avoiding miscalculation that could trigger nuclear war. Viktor Andreev's network, providing information about American radar systems, was a small part of Soviet efforts to understand American military capabilities and intentions. The engineers in Viktor's network who betrayed their country did so believing they were preventing war. Robert Hayes testified at his trial that he feared American military superiority would tempt the United States to launch a preventive nuclear strike against the Soviet Union before Soviet capabilities improved. By providing the Soviets with radar technology information, Hayes believed he was creating a deterrent that would make war less likely. This reasoning, which seems naive in retrospect, was persuasive to some Americans during the 1950s. The FBI's challenge was distinguishing between legitimate dissent about nuclear policy and actual espionage motivated by that dissent. The microfilm from the hollowed-out nickel, once developed and analyzed by FBI technical experts, revealed remarkably detailed instructions for intelligence gathering. The Soviet handlers had specified exactly what information they wanted about radar frequency ranges, pulse repetition rates, and signal processing techniques. They had also provided guidance on how to photograph documents without being detected. where to place microfilm for pickup, and how to recognize surveillance. The level of detail demonstrated the KGB's professionalism and their long experience in running espionage operations against sophisticated counterintelligence services. Timothy Carter's life after the espionage case unfolded in ways shaped by that childhood experience. He pursued engineering partly because of interests Mr. Anderson had encouraged, creating a complicated legacy. Timothy's work in communications technology contributed to systems that, ironically, were designed to be secure against exactly the kind of espionage Victor had practiced. In his 60s, Timothy gave a series of interviews about the case, prompted by the 50th anniversary of Victor's arrest. He spoke thoughtfully about how the experience had taught him that people are complex, that good and evil often exist in the same person, and that the world is more ambiguous than children's storybooks suggest. The Andreev case also revealed the limits of human intelligence gathering during the Cold War. Despite successfully recruiting sources with access to classified information, the Soviet Union still struggled to match American technological capabilities. Information alone wasn't enough. The Soviets also needed the industrial capacity, scientific expertise, and economic resources to implement what they learned. Soviet radar systems, though improved by stolen American technology, never achieved parity with American systems because the broader technological ecosystem in the Soviet Union lagged behind. Espionage could close gaps, but couldn't overcome fundamental economic and social differences. The ethical questions raised by the case resonated for decades. Was Timothy Carter right to show the nickel to his teacher? Should he have taken it directly to his parents or authorities? These questions are ultimately unanswerable, but they highlight the difficulty of navigating security concerns in daily life. Timothy was a child following his natural instincts to share an interesting discovery with a trusted adult. He couldn't have known that adult was a spy. The lesson for counterintelligence professionals was that security often depends on ordinary citizens making unpredictable choices that accidentally expose carefully planned operations. The Franklin Elementary School itself changed in subtle ways after the scandal. Teachers became more cautious about forming close relationships with students, worried that anything they said or did might be misinterpreted. The school board implemented policies that created more distance between teachers and the community they served. Some parents became more involved in their children's education, attending classes and scrutinizing curriculum, while others withdrew, trusting less in the institution's judgment. These changes reflected broader transformations in American society as the Cold War's paranoia seeped into everyday life. Viktor Andreev's success in maintaining his cover for 7 years demonstrated remarkable discipline and psychological resilience. Living a lie every day, constantly vigilant for any slip that might expose him, unable to form genuine relationships for fear of revealing himself, Viktor endured isolation that few people could tolerate. KGB training emphasized this psychological preparation, but no training could fully prepare someone for the loneliness of deep cover work. Viktor's occasional expressions of fondness for his teaching years suggested that even while betraying his adopted country, he experienced genuine human connections that made the betrayal emotionally costly. The hollowed-out nickel technique, though compromised by Viktor's dropped coin, continued to be used by Soviet intelligence. The FBI's discovery of the method didn't make it useless because the technique's strength wasn't secrecy, but rather its simplicity. A coin was such a common object that even knowing it might be used for espionage didn't make searching for every coin practical. Soviet intelligence simply became more careful about handling such devices, ensuring they were secured in ways that prevented accidental loss. The cat-and-mouse game between espionage and counter-espionage continued, with each side learning from the other's successes and failures. The human cost of espionage extended beyond Viktor and his network to their families. Viktor had no family in America, part of his cover, but Robert Hayes and the other engineers had wives and children who were devastated by the arrests. Their families faced social ostracism, financial hardship, while the breadwinners were imprisoned, and psychological trauma from the revelation that someone they loved had betrayed the country. These families were innocent victims of choices they hadn't made and couldn't have prevented. Their suffering was multiplied across numerous espionage cases during the Cold War, a reminder that spying damages far more lives than just those of the spies themselves. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories, and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.